Wonderful. Thank you, Hannah, and thank you, Innovate US, for having me here today. It's such a pleasure to see you all and join you all here today. So before we get started talking about delivering data science projects in government, I actually want to start on, one second, make sure I should start sharing my screen, one second. The obligatory, can you all see? We're good? We're good to go? All right.
We can see
So
it.
before we jump into data science projects, what I first want to do is talk about rats. Okay, so back in 2015, the city of Chicago had a rat problem. And at the same time, they had a bunch of 311 phone calls, so complaints about rats in the city. And they wondered, hey, could we use this data to predict where we would find rat outbreaks and then target those rat outbreaks proactively? And you may have heard of this story. And so they did this, and this was sort of one of the earliest successful data science projects in municipal government. And pretty soon, funders and data science groups around the country, they wanted to help other cities tackle their rat problem. Right. And we received multiple offers of support. This was when I was in San Francisco to pursue this. And when I went and I talked to my public health department, they just sort of looked at me and they're like, well, Joy, rats aren't really like, that's not a thing for us. That's not a priority. And I'm like, okay, well, what are your priorities? And they struggled to articulate them. The same thing happened. Another jurisdiction was predicting lead poisoning cases. Another jurisdiction wanted to predict where to put fire and smoke alarms. And every time we heard about some cool data science project, our departments just didn't resonate. They didn't care. So for a while, we stayed away from data science projects, but we wanted to figure out what is a way that we should be doing data science in government. And in talking, so today what we're going to talk to you about is what we learned both in San Francisco and at the state, and talking with colleagues all around the country about data science and government. How do you first develop a pipeline of data science projects in your jurisdiction? And we're going to touch on key aspects of delivering those data science projects that I think will help you avoid what we call the model on the shelf problem in data science. And then we're going to talk about how to celebrate your data science projects and why it's important to celebrate and tell your data science stories. And then we're going to finish with some closing food for thought as you approach data work in your own organization. But before we dive into data science, I want to step back and give you a simple framework for assessing your organization's overall data maturity level and where data science fits into that. So at the state of California, we really wanted a tool to help departments diagnose, okay, how can they see where they're at and then make improvements in how they manage and use data. And we really wanted this tool to describe data issues from the business side so departments can self-diagnose regardless of data or technical literacy. And it's a two-step process. So step one is to first get your data house in order. And what this looks like is everything from level one, the data void, and this is where you can't answer basic questions about your programs and services. This is a little facetious. We found most departments were in the level of data void, but a lot of departments are in the land of data fire drills. And so this is where you can answer basic and ad hoc questions about your programs and services, but only after scrambling to pull the data together. And if you had to repeat the fire drill, the numbers might not match the next time. And so an example of this might be in your jurisdiction. You release, an annual report that you have to statutorily release every year, but then the media gets a hold of it, a legislative elected gets a hold of it, and they're like, hey, can we have this a different way, this data? And your department's like, oh my God, we have to run back and, go back to IT and ask for a CSV download, and, chaos ensues, right? And so our goal at the state was we wanted really to get all of our departments to level 3, data on demand, where your existing data and measures are available on mandatory reports, and they're all automated and they're returning trusted numbers. So once you have data on demand, that's when step 2 comes to play. And step 2 is really a menu of options for using data in decision making. And you want to define your business need and then select the right approach. And so the first menu option is performance management. You've probably heard this, right? Everyone's been talking about performance management since CompStat in the 90s, right? It's a suite of tools for selecting, developing, and managing with metrics for your program, services, and contracts. The other bucket is evaluation experiments, right? And this is about evaluating your program, the impact, or testing a new program and service or a design feature. But today, what we're really going to zoom in on and focus on is advanced analytics and data science. And really, that's a suite of tools for exploring business questions, developing new insights, or new tools and services. And I want to contrast this with performance management and evaluation experimentation, because this is really about using AI and machine learning in government projects. And I also want to distinguish, we're going to be mostly focused on predictive AI, not generative AI. There's tons of great resources on Innovate US on Gen AI, but we're going to touch Don't Fair on Gen AI and its role in predictive AI. And then lastly, we wanted our departments to have ongoing tools and approaches to doing exploratory data analysis and data development, because it really feeds the rest of these activities. So with that grounding in our data maturity model, let's dive into the key factors that allowed us to develop, both in San Francisco and the state, a pipeline of real legit data science projects. So I mentioned no one was biting at the rat idea and those other projects. And in talking with colleagues across the country, we identified a problem we came to collectively call the truffle pig problem. And it was by far the biggest barrier to building out a pipeline of data science projects. And so if you're not familiar with truffles or truffle pigs, essentially, as you can see, they're very cute. And what they do is they can sniff out this delicious delicacy under dirt and help you discover your truffle pig problems. So for us, the truffle pig problem was how to sniff out those good data science projects that we just knew were lurking out in our departments. And you sort of know you have a truffle pig problem if, one, people are like, can I have a dashboard? Can I have a dashboard? Or if you're thinking data science means dashboards, there's nothing wrong with dashboards. They're really important, as you know, for performance management, and they might be the output of a data science project, but they are not data science. Or people might be like, hey, can we have a data warehouse, just somewhere we can dump all our data so we can put it? That's a data infrastructure project. Again, data science will lean on it, but not be there. Lastly, if they're like, hey, come in and automate this business process, that's a great IT project, but again, not necessarily a data science project. And so there's nothing wrong with all of these. They're all good things, but we learned when we kept getting these weird requests was that we really need to build the vocabulary of our business and program staff so they could translate their business needs into the capabilities of data science. Essentially, we wanted to teach them how to opportunity spot data science in their own programs and services. So our solution was the project topology. And this was actually modified based on some great work our colleagues in New Orleans had done. And we iterated and ripped off of what they did. And what it does is it creates these sort of project types or recipes for common problems you're going to see. And what we would do is we describe each of these projects and then give a bunch of relevant examples. And we're going to walk through some of those right now. So the first example is prioritize your backlog. So you have a service issue where you have a backlog of stuff, right? It could be audits, project reviews, service requests, inspections, you name it. And historically, a program or service, they tackle it first in, first out, what we call FIFO. And what we do on the data science side is we say, hey, we're going to look at your prior and current cases, and we're going to group them into categories, right? We think there's a method to your backlog madness. And then the service change we're going to introduce is we're essentially going to reshuffle your backlog, or we're going to manage your backlog differently from FIFO. And of course, then the result is that the department is now working on high priority cases first. And that might be risk or opportunity or need. It just depends. So a specific example of this was something we did in San Francisco. And the service issue was how to process a giant backlog of property sales. And the idea here is that the city, and all counties actually, San Francisco is odd in that it's a city and a county, one of their biggest source of revenues is property taxes. And so when a property sells, you have to say, do we think that's a fair sales price? Is that equal to the fair market value? And of course they do this because you want to be at fair market value, because let's say I sell a property to my niece and I give her a great deal on it. You still got to be taxed at the market value, unfortunately, death and taxes. So the city typically and historically had done this by, working with assessors. They would assess a bunch of things: property characteristics, location, square feet, etc. But this was still creating an enormous backload of work for the assessor's office. So what we did is we came in and said, okay, we're going to help you prioritize this backlog of stuff. And so analyzing the detailed property and sale data, we were able to make a suite of prediction models based on the property types. So there were condos, multifamily, and single family. We blended this with the various characteristics: date sold, square feet, location, bedrooms, bathrooms, and essentially would generate a predicted price for every single property in the city and county of San Francisco. So the service change was, we'd say, okay, here's our predicted price. And we'd say, well, if that sale price is within some range, we're going to say, hey, with some quality checks, we're going to accept that as the fair market value and basically tax them as sooner than later. And just for context, historically, people were getting their new tax amount 3+ years later. And this allowed them to assess much sooner, so it was much faster time to revenue. But then if sale prices fell outside of that range, we're like, well, you know what? Those are ones that need a full appraisal. Like, they need full hands-on looking at that. The very first model run reduced the roll value. That meant the property sort of sitting to be assessed by 10%. And it essentially allowed us to access well over 200 million, leading immediately to faster access to 2.8 million in tax revenue. And that was from the very first model run. They actually deployed the model into production, and along with a bunch of process improvements and other things, they were able to actually eliminate their entire backlog. Another project type is flag stuff early, right? So in this case, the service question is how to predict future conditions. Like, someone might be headed towards a bad thing or a good thing, and you don't want to be surprised at the end. And so again, our process was to model out, using historical and current data, a range of possible outcomes. And then the idea would be, where can we divert people from this outcome they're headed towards? And the result on the department side is that they could have proactive early intervention as opposed to responsive reaction and services. An example of this was WIC. So WIC stands for Women, Infants, and Children, and it's a nutrition program for low-income families. And what they were seeing is they were seeing retention results fall over time. People weren't staying in the program, both for their first babies, but then through the life cycle of the program through age 5. Only 28% of families stayed with the program. And the team had ideas about it. They're like, maybe the economic conditions are different. Maybe there's less interest now because of some of the political issues that were going on. So we ended up stepping in, and we worked to develop a tree model and tested a variety of different models. But the tree model really helped explain what was going on to our clients. And really what sort of popped out is that, one, it became very important if you were speaking English or not, right? And they were the English speakers had the lowest retention in the population. Also, feeding choice, breastfeeding or bottle feeding, was another big predictor of whether or not people stayed in. And so, working with the WIC team, we sort of developed some theories about this, but we realized we actually had to do a little bit more. And since we had identified those populations at risk of dropping out, we need to understand why. So quantitative analysis is great for answering who, what, when, where, sometimes how, but we partnered with another group to do a qualitative analysis that tried to understand really why are they being retained. And we found out that like one of our theories was people felt stigmatized as English speakers using this program. So a lot of this led to the service change of doing anti-stigma campaign, new technology around making it easier for signups, and also doing better outreach and engagement with doctors so they could message differently about the program. All right, I think we got time for one more topology. So this one's called flag stuff early. So in this case, the service question is, how do you predict future conditions? This is find the needle in the haystack. So in this case, you have a population, it could be people, it could be geographies, it could be different stuff, and you're really trying to identify targets in that population. So again, what we do in data science is we try to identify those targets and pick out features that really help people pop out as being of interest in a population. And then what you can do, instead of targeting with the whole population, you can zoom in on those targeted populations. And again, the result is that you're spending your resources where they're most needed. So one of these examples for us was, again, taxes. It's always a popular thing to use data science in. And the question here was, how can we target audits of a new tax? So the city and county of San Francisco had rolled out something called gross tax receipts, and they were transitioning from payroll, which was basically an attempt to, get more revenue. And a few years after the rollout, they really wanted to have a better way of targeting their audits because they knew this new tax was really complicated, and they knew that people were, having lots of questions and confusion about it. And they sort of wanted to understand how they should be doing their audits differently. And they asked us to help. So we found many patterns that were very interesting in the tax filings, but one of the key patterns we found was a combination of, we'd get people who had very large gross receipts. So these were receipts that included sales and payroll and all of this, but they had like almost no one on their payroll. And we're like, well, what kind of companies are like that? That's a really weird and interesting company. And then the other one was, we'd find folks who had tiny gross receipts, but a giant payroll. And again, so these might be perfectly legitimate business types, but they were interesting and odd enough that they stuck out to our client. And we also didn't want to assume bad behavior because it was a new tax, it was complicated, people were in a learning stage. But the service change that it led to was that they'd gone from doing 500 audits annually that they'd select by random sample. And so what they switched to was they took those 500 audits, they split them, and they continued to do 50% at a random sample, and then 50% they would target based on these flags and these indicators of anomalous filing that we made for them. And then they would, for a subset of the flags we found that were particularly interesting, they focused on education and outreach. So the problem topology could help us sort of turn our departments into those truffle prigs, but we still need to help them. We still need to get them to want to work with us. And, as a central data team, we would often get a range of reactions to data science as a service. Everything from get out of our business, we're doing this already, you're just trying to be like the sexy team in town, to, you're being trendy. No one, I don't think anyone really thinks that anymore. I think data science is a well understood and valued piece of the data improvement or the government improvement puzzle. But then, of course, we had our overly eagerly folks. And so the problem topology could help us identify those problems right for data science. We still needed the right clients, which led to what I like to call the anatomy of a committed client. So the project topology helped us, find those real data science projects. But first and foremost, a problem right for data science, it needs to involve a service change. And so hopefully you've heard that in the story so far. We don't want to just have models that like, oh, great, you have a cool question, and we can always answer questions by looking at data, but what materially changes in the organization around that? But if you're going to create organizational change, maybe change a business process, eliminate a business process, etc., you really, 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 really need leadership buy-in, because it's very hard to create and affect change, right, in any entity. But at the same time, even if you have leadership buy-in, you really need to have your internal project champion, right? If you don't have that sort of person who really believes in the project, is really excited, but also has the right relationships and connections across the department to Everything from data access to corralling people to show up at the right meetings, all of those things are really essential to your project success. And then lastly, of course, organizational mission and alignment, which for us typically meant either budget priorities or elected priorities, etc. But we had already learned, as I mentioned at the top of the hour, that begging folks to work with us was never very successful, right? It was as if like they were doing a favor by deigning to work with us. But at the same time, I had noticed this other phenomenon, which is departments who would never work together, possibly sworn enemy departments, or programs sometimes within departments. That happens a lot too. Like, you guys are touching the same population. Why aren't you talking to each other? However, they were suddenly much more likely to join forces when there were dollars on the line, right? This could be budget dollars, but it could also be, maybe a foundation has a grant. And so I would observe the phenomenon that these sort of departments that struggled to work together were suddenly interested in collaborating for some grant money, right? And it got me thinking, can we leverage a similar psychology with data science as a service? Which led to our solution to have an application process, right? And this application process essentially inverted the power dynamic. So instead of begging people to use our services, instead they applied to work with us, and we use the project topology to help them frame and scope their problems, both in terms of what the problem was, the kind of topology, but also the service change that they were anticipating. Now, a note of caution, if you pursue a similar approach in your own jurisdiction, if you want to introduce an application or a form or a selection process, you really kind of want to, avoid no. You don't want to, if someone is coming to you for help and you're just like, sorry, we can't help you. I think you're putting your entire data work at risk, because at its heart, I think a lot of the data functions and institutions and in the public space are still really at their core about change management. I used to joke that my title was not Chief Data Officer, it was Chief Change Management Officer. And so if you pique someone's interest about making change and using data better, you want to find a way to satisfy them and push them into other parts of your portfolio, which also helps you make more friends. So I encourage you to have gentle off-ramps, is the term of art that we used to use. So in San Francisco, we had a data academy. So we would give people, sometimes we'd say, oh, well, there was always a huge backlog of people who wanted to get in the classes. And we're like, okay, we'll give you a privileged access, or we'll give your department a special training. At the state of California, we had other services that we could divert them around, whether it was a data infrastructure project or a dashboard capacity building, or just free consulting hours. Like, hey, you get time with X, Y, and Z where bring your problem, or we'll present to your department about something. So if you don't have other services that you can sort of offer across your jurisdiction, I would encourage you to ask, why are you starting with data science? Go back to that data maturity model we talked about and think about, what are the other data needs across your jurisdiction that are being unmet? The next key pipeline task was to score and balance a manageable portfolio. So we would literally get our team in a room and do something called poker planning, which is a technique from software engineering. You can Google it, where we'd essentially score the projects. And it was really about how complex is the project and how valuable it is. And dimensions were everything from how hard would it be to access data, right? We would get projects where anytime you're dealing with a project with protected data, you got to be really thoughtful about how long is it really going to take to access that data. It always takes longer than anyone thinks, right? Or is the data tucked behind a contractor managed vendor system where the departments never actually touch the data, right? These are all important dimensions of thinking, figuring out the real viability of a data science project. So if you go through the process and you score your applicants and find that they're all sort of hovering in these like high complex, high value thing, honestly, you're a bit in the danger zone, because these are going to be messy, somewhat unpredictable to manage and deliver on projects. And you can overwhelm your team while simultaneously underwhelming your clients. And there's a few strategies for staggering out high complex projects, because you also don't exactly want to say no. And we'll sort of touch on some of those techniques through the rest of this talk. So our goal in every cohort, and I won't be talking about this today, but we typically operated in cohorts, and there was a lot of thinking and reasoning behind that, and that might be some future down the road content. But we'd essentially have like, we want at least one, and certainly no more than a couple, like very high complex, high value, high impact projects. But we also really wanted to have some quick wins that were high value, but really easy and fast that our team could deliver or sort of quickly or squeeze in between the high complexity projects when we'd be waiting on data or who knows what. And then say a conditional yes to those lower value projects. And then those ones that don't make sense to do, try to divert or reframe into some of our other services. And this is a pretty classic sort of prioritization matrix that we found very helpful to use and keep in mind in scoring our data science work. So once you have your pipeline, now it's time to deliver on those data science projects. And one of the absolute worst things you can do is, you've been waiting to get this data, like nothing is better than getting like a new juicy data set to chew on. And unfortunately, a phenomenon we would see, especially when working with some of our more academic partners, is they would grab the data and disappear into what I call the data science cave. And the data science cave is like this wonderful place where you're surrounded by all this juicy data, and there's so many caverns to explore, and like the ceilings are different, and it's just like it's a really wonderful, gorgeous place. And you're a data person, so you love to spend a lot of time there. And you pop out one day and you're like, hey client, look at this amazing shiny glittering model I have. And the client is just like, I don't know what that is. How did you get there? Why haven't you been talking to me? Or you've been talking to me in this language that makes no sense. So it's very, 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 very is to bring your client with you on the analytical journey. And so what this meant for us is we would communicate the phases of analysis and what to expect. We never jumped to modeling. And a big benefit of this, and part of this was we would pre-schedule meetings with our clients so they know they're being briefed. This is what they're being briefed on, and we're going to use this to inform the analysis. And so what the real advantage of this, there's a couple great advantages to this, but one is you sometimes in the course of working with your client who's watching you start and go through the exploratory analysis where you're just trying to understand the data, sometimes you can answer some of their biggest questions early on, because depending on the department and their background and their data, they might have never looked at their data like this before. For example, we had one department that had only looked at their data in 1 year snapshots because that's what was, statutorily required to report on. And they suddenly got to see multiple years by all these slices, and they gleaned so much just from that experience that they were going to be satisfied whether or not we delivered a working machine learning model. And so you might end up with like a happy client, less work. But the other dimensions is that, there's several reasons why you want to bring them along with you. And we would turn this into every meeting was our team delivering a product, typically a digestible deck. We were not sharing Python notebooks with them for the most part. You might have an audience that makes sense to do. But the meetings, we would schedule those with the project charter. And essentially what we were able to do with those things is really start to dial into what they need and bring them along so they understood where the analysis was leading and where it was going, so there were no surprises. And also, in order to ensure a service change, so again, going back to our anatomy of a committed client, and we don't want the model on the shelf, you really need to budget time for user and context research, because you might end up with something that doesn't solve their problem, or sometimes you can't use the best model isn't implementable. We had that in one of our clients. They had some statutory thing where they were really nervous about using a particular modeling approach, or you might deliver a product that's not usable. And so our team had a playbook that we used to do this work. And we talked about the Assessor Tax project earlier. So when we were in the exploratory analysis phase, we're also doing a bunch of research on the business processes. And so in addition to looking through their business processes, we also got walkthroughs, and we actually sat down with 3 separate assessors and had them walk through their processes. And we were very strategic about the assessors that we met with. We met with one who had been a long time, I've been here forever, I've been doing this assessor. Another one was recent to the city, but had substantial experience from another jurisdiction. And then there was someone who's pretty new to doing assessments. And so by one, sitting down and going through the current state assessment process, with each of these different groups, one, we got to know them. They got sort of engaged and involved in the project, but we also learned so much about how different what they were doing, as well as what were the really important and salient features to them in doing their work. But we also got to see things like their desk setup, their monitor setup, the fact that they would do their work in Excel and then they would turn to a black screen, those black screen programs with the green letters, right? They had a lot of stuff they were navigating when they were trying to do their assessments. And we really were able to understand that nuance. And so when we finally delivered the output of a model, we were really able to tailor it. And then we went further. We actually did usability testing on the outputs with a broader set of assessors. And what that does is create, by doing this organizational context and research and then user testing, is you actually build more buy-in because more folks get to touch and shape and influence the product, all of which fosters ownership, again, leading to greater adoption. The next recommendation, and this is really, this isn't my recommendation. This is from a wonderful woman named Kimberly Hicks, who I have hired twice and can't recommend highly enough. But, we talked earlier about the data science cave and how much fun it is to chew on data and explore all those analytical pathways. But she came up with this phrase about squeeze, don't wring the data. And what I think she means by this is how do you know when you're done squeezing and not wringing? But this is really where your client needs need to drive your analytical needs, right? And this is where having a very thoughtful project charter, and every time you start to glimpse a really interesting analytical pathway, you have to step back and be like, how does that help my client inform and change how are they doing their work? And if it doesn't, maybe you need to put that on the back burner and focus on your client's needs, not your data science thrills. So the next part of delivery is really about incorporating data ethics into the data science lifecycle. And when we wanted to do data science as a service, this was, I think, 2017, when we first started doing it, there's a lot of newspaper articles out about ethics. I mean, now there's a whole new batch with Gen AI out there, right? And everyone was concerned about this. And there were a few principle lists or very short checklists. But there was honestly no practical guidance for government entities. So we ended up teaming up with a couple different groups, including GovX at Johns Hopkins, Harvard's DataSmart, and some other folks. And we co-developed something called the Ethics and Algorithms Toolkit. And essentially what this was is a risk management tool to identify and mitigate risk. This is still available online, though it does need updating. In deploying it, we've made lots of changes to it over time. But I want to step back and highlight the key dimensions of ethics and risk that you need to consider in your data science projects and develop a repeatable process to address those. So the first is all about impact, right? Who, what, where, when, is impacted, right? Sometimes it's stuff that's impacted, but, who is using that stuff? Sometimes it's specific neighborhoods or geographies or states or regions that are affected. And of course, individuals. But how are they impacted, right? Is it no access denied? You don't get access to that service? Is it an economic impact for them? Does it affect their reputation or their emotional state, their mental health? Is there an IP threat, right? An intellectual property threat, or is there actual physical danger and threat? The next piece of impact is understanding not just the primary impact, but the secondary and unexpected and unintended impacts, right? And I think all of us have been, hopefully reading the newspapers over the years, and we really see when you introduce algorithmic decision making or algorithmically informed, you can have all kinds of unintentional impacts that aren't just about the particular number that you're optimizing, right? I mean, the private sector example is like optimizing, engagement. What are, that there's been a lot of talk about what optimizing that metric means. But, in the context of government projects, you're not usually just affecting a family or maybe an individual. You're usually affecting a family. You might be affecting a community. You might be affecting an institution. It could be your institution. It could be a partner institution. It doesn't matter. But these are all things that you want to step back and spend time thinking about. The next thing is the scope of impact. And this is really a function of degree and scale. So degree is, how badly are they affected, or how intensely, right, is really the word. Is it a small amount or is it a big amount? And then what's the scale, right? So is it affecting everyone in that population or just like a small group of it? And so so you might have a project, a data science project, that's just going to sort of like, have a minor impact, but for a substantial number of people. And so the tool that we used helped us like put that into a scope impact. Next, you have to ask, is your use of the data in the data science project appropriate? And, I would side note, argue that this outfit might be a little inappropriate for the context. But appropriate use in data is really about being, a couple of things. One is being consistent and compatible with its original purpose, right? And so is it for sure, clearly checkbox, yes, we're good to go? It's a complex, hard to answer. Is it definitely questionable? Or is it clearly, nope, stop, don't go there? But then you also have to consider how would people react, what we always used to call the New York Times front page test, right? If people hear about this story, is there generally going to be favorable? Are people going to be mixed? Or are they going to be, sort of against it? So for example, if you're thinking about doing a data science project, using data in a way that is not consistent with how it was collected, and if people heard about it, they'd find it upsetting, it's probably a bad idea, right? And so next, then you need to consider accountability risks, right? And so accountability is in part a function of automation, right? Is the tool human mediated? Is it algorithmically mediated, or is it algorithmically determined? So for example, if a tool assigns people a risk score for sentencing or incarceration, I think we've all heard those news stories. Is it automatically applied, or is it just an input into a human that's mediating that decision? But accountability is also about being able to explain the algorithm to someone. Is it easy to understand right away? Like, oh, we got it. Does it take some explaining, but we can get there? Or is it just really impenetrable, right? And then lastly, can we audit it? So is the nature of the algorithm something we can sort of open up and inspect and understand how it's using its variables, its features? Or is it sort of really, we can't really pull it apart? Sometimes we've chosen to use easier, to explain and audit algorithms given the public nature question in mind. So it might be less predictive, but easier to audit and explain. But for example, you might have something that is fully automated, but it's super easy to explain and we can audit it. That might be okay, right? So the level of automation is really an interaction effect with these other dimensions. And of course, you have to consider bias. And there's the standard, and even standard statistical bias is so complex when you really dig into it, or technical bias, could be from having bad sample data or not representative, but you also have to consider the societal and historical bias that's baked in, not just the data you might be using, but also the business process and the policies around it that might be in play in terms of the decision. And this often, almost always, you need to require a range of stakeholders to really understand and assess this appropriately. And so over time, this repeatable process became a core part of the project lifecycle. In our project lifecycle, we'd have our project charter, which I didn't talk about today. Lots to talk about there. We talked about data access. We talked about using design thinking to get that knowledge and business thing. And then there was that okay, let's put this thing, this question through our toolkit before we do modeling, and then let's do it afterwards, because a lot of things happens during analysis and modeling, and you want to make sure that you're revisiting all those key ethical questions. Ethics is not a done once and check mark process, right? It needs to be revisited, not just through the life cycle of developing your algorithm, but then as it goes out there and lives in the world. And this repeatable process that is practical is so important, because we are working with things that are inherently uncertain, both, technical and societal. Like, new technology is coming out all the time. Gen AI has been insane in the amount of changes it's brought, but also societal representations and perceptions are constantly shifting. There's no such thing as zero risk, right? There's risk of doing data science, and then there's risks of not doing data science, right? It's always that compared to what question you have to ask. And that's where, like, that repeatable policy that allows you to balance risk with benefit is so key to ensuring an ethical approach to your use of data science and machine learning. So we've talked about finding your projects. We've talked about delivering your projects. Now, for the fun part, we're going to talk about celebrating your projects. And if you're doing data science, I want you to consider having a demo day. And for us, the reason why we found this helpful was for a few different reasons. So one, I mentioned earlier that we worked in cohorts. It served as a forcing function to wrap up each cohort, and it created that space to celebrate success. And I personally am sometimes bad at pausing and celebrating success, so it was a good process for me. But maybe even important than that, it really empowers your client and brings closure, because what it's doing is it's creating a natural end to your engagement. And we would actually, before we engage with our clients as part of our application process, we're like, hey, we're going to do a demo day, and we're going to be writing case studies of these projects. So they know from day one they're on the hook for it, and they need to present on it. And so this really helps drive your client to a visible win with some closure and service change. And so they want a good story to tell for demo day. So not only is it really helpful for a few other reasons, it's really that client closure that's so helpful. Because also, we sometimes found once clients were working with us, they never wanted to let us go. They just wanted to keep us around, and we're like, no guys, we got to do demo day, got to move on to the next cohort, right? So when you go to tell your stories, and whether you do demo day or some other thing, I encourage you to standardize your narrative structure. Hopefully you've seen this in the presentation. In our case, we made each project about the service question or issue that a department had, what the data insights were, what did we do differently as a result, right? No model sitting on the shelf. And then what were the results of that change, right? And we would pull this narrative structure like a thread throughout the entire process, from, our brown bag solicitations, but also our application had these were standard questions on it, to then even the project charter that we would sign with our client. And during that narrative at demo day, our team would get up and we'd only talk for the data science piece, right? The rest of it was our client telling their own story, which again, put them front and center at both the leadership and the change, and owning that change. And when you're drafting your data science stories, think kindergarten, not death by deck, right? The narrative structure can help you do this, but you really need to focus on simplifying your storytelling and not complex modeling. If anything, you want to bury the data science piece and really focus on the business question and problem, how it was answered, and what's different in the world. And part of that means you might need to throw out your typical data visuals. You're telling a business story or a program story, not a story on your data science methods. Obviously, there's some tailoring based on your audience. I'll come back to this, but for example, we worked with the Arts Commission, and they were trying to score wear and tear on public art installations. And so, their current method was, yielding some very weird results, like where very strong, durable marble materials were scoring the same in terms of needing refurbishing as fragile, art out and exposed to the winds on the cliffs of San Francisco, right? And so we didn't show those scores, we showed a visual that we unpacked and explained. And so I think this is a very important part. If you're finding yourself, when you're telling your story, if you're showing like a chart of p-values, you're probably showing the wrong stuff. And this is where I came to that being said, you know, this is probably already a couple of years ago, I met with the data science team at US Treasury. And they're doing, or they were at the time, they were doing really great stuff. And, you know, what do we have at Treasury? Treasury, there's armies of economists, right? You might, maybe you don't need to tailor your storytelling as much there, but you'd be surprised at how much everyone enjoys a good story. Lastly, showcase your work so people can discover it, your clients, and refer to it. And whenever possible, we would actually capture client testimonials. And together, these pieces became key to our internal business development strategy, which I like to call the virtuous solicitation cycle, right? We get new projects and then we tell the story, you know, sometimes through a demo day, sometimes through a case study. And then we would showcase those stories at our brown bags for our next solicitation. We'd have prior clients come, and there's nothing better than a prior client coming and being like, oh, we loved working with them. We're trying to come up with another project so we can apply again, right? All of which would lead to new clients. So it become essentially a self-perpetuating wheel. If you'd like to learn more, there's a 4-part blog post that I co-authored with, I want to give a shout out to 2 former colleagues. I mentioned Kim Hicks earlier and Dave Valenta. They're really fabulous and wonderful people. And this goes into some of the nuances of some of the things I talked about, as well as more details. So now I want to close with just some, well, closing food for thought. Don't always jump into data science. You do want to make sure your core pieces are in place. And that's where, remember to use the data maturity model to diagnose where you are. You might not be ready for data science. That being said, and this happened with one of our programs, sometimes data science projects can trigger getting your data house in order. So there was a project where I mentioned this, you know, sometimes data's, you know, tucked behind contractor managed vendor systems, right? And we had a project where we needed to get all their years of data. So data access was tough because the contractor managed the vendor system and they'd never pulled the data. But we were able to, you know, so we led with the data science project, but the act of getting that data access and then through the exploratory analysis phase, they suddenly started thinking about their data differently. So that really positioned them to actually activate step 1, right? So the data science project was actually a catalyst for step 1. So I offer this as a framework, but like all things, it might depend on your context. And there's nothing like a really well-motivated data science project to like update your data infrastructure and your data management and how you think about and manage your data. The next thing is beware of Goodhart's law. And this is really more in the performance management world, but it often comes up in data science projects because you're typically trying to predict and influence a particular measure. For example, in the WIC example, women, infants, and children example, we talked about retention of the children and families babies at 1 year and at 5 years. In performance measures, you often see this, like we want to improve retention by 5%, or you know, any number of measures, right, from the world of measurement land. In Goodhart's law is essentially when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. And the best way to illustrate it is this fun little cartoon I found. So they say if you measure people on number of nails made, then you might get thousands of tiny nails, right? And is that really what you want? Conversely, if you measure people on the weight of nails made, then you might get a few giant heavy nails. Again, it's not kind of what you want. And so if you're familiar with results-based accountability or balanced scorecards, any of these kinds of things, they're really trying to kind of crack the Goodhart's law problem, and it's a real problem. And I would argue that they can help counter it, but they almost never eliminate it. So just be aware of this. The incentive structure that is created by badly designed targets is especially challenging in the public sector because of the scrutiny and media oversight that we have. It can be often hard for entities to back down from bad targets. The other thing I want you to keep in mind is that public programs come in different flavors, just like ice cream. And those different flavors have different data needs. So at the state of California, we had a lot of what I called researcher regulators. So these are departments that have loads of PhDs. They have actually often large, complex data sets. They're focused on studies and analysis. They might have a lot of data science capability. So an example in the state of California was the California EPA, Environmental Protection Agency. Or the water conservation team, right? And so their data needs and their data sophistication might be quite different from, let's say, a funder department. In this case, a funder department is not really operating services or regulating, but they're actually passing through funds typically to local jurisdictions. Again, their focus, they might have more policy and planning staff. They might have a huge range of data sizes and assets, maybe managed in Excel, we see all the time. And their sort of data needs might be more evaluation and assessment. They have grants, contract management. So again, they might need a different flavor or set of topologies around data science. And then lastly, service providers. Usually this is a great opportunity for data science because they tend to have more operational, fewer data staff, so they have less in-house capacity. Secondly, they have like lots of great transactional data sitting in their systems to chew on. And there's a real opportunity in particular for performance management and operational and advanced analytics. So just be aware of like thinking about what kind of program is this? What kind of data people are there? Because that also speaks to how successful you'll be in deploying and executing any of your working algorithms. The next thing is don't let technology drive the change, especially now with Gen AI, right? Which I happen to use to make this image. And so do not ask me what is happening right here. I have no idea. It's like the person's finger is melting into their leg. I don't know what's happening. But Gen AI is the topic du jour. So, no data science talk should be complete without it. But what I want to offer is an analogy called the data gem that hopefully you can use to clarify roles and responsibilities. And it works sort of something like this. IT, your technology staff, they maintain the gym, right? They rent the space, they rent the equipment, they help make sure like the service contracts are in place to keep it up to snuff. And data teams and your data scientists, they're kind of like the trainers, right? They're going to help you target your trouble spots, help you use the equipment in the right sequence. But business needs to show up and commit to getting in shape and to set their priorities. They're the only ones that understand their priorities and needs, and they know how to make the changes to their services and their businesses and their processes. So if they're not driving the data science work, it's not going to happen. Something I didn't talk about, but have thought about deeply and worked on for many years is data staffing and talent. First off, many others have talked about this, and I don't want to focus on content that, you could get other places. But also my personal thinking on this is evolving really rapidly, and I'd be curious to hear what other folks are thinking, because the reality is Gen AI is impacting this heavily, and I think there's going to be lots of uncertainty about the future. The very tools and approaches that people are using in data science workflows are going through a major upheaval, and I think this has major implications for people and talent. And there's a great recent article that I can also put in the chat that showcases in this article, the author goes through an analysis, and they don't do ML, they don't do any modeling, but they just explain how rapidly, and they do nice screenshots showing how rapidly using Gen AI they're able to do an analytics workflow. It's essentially streamlining and decreasing time to value. So this makes Gen AI very vital in the life cycle of data analytics. So if your data science teams aren't using Gen AI as part of their toolkit, or IT is telling them they can't, that's a mistake and that's a problem. On the other hand, I don't think Gen AI is going to solve the cultural and institutional blockers to using data. That just, It's just not, I think. I think those are all things that are still going to remain. But I do think government adoption of AI is going to look, Gen AI is going to look very different from traditional or predictive AI and ML, which honestly has been slower. It's been around longer, but I think adoption has been faster in Gen AI. And so I'm just adding a blog post that I wrote a few months ago on this. Lastly, I want to end on this note. This space is vast, right? We're still learning and experimenting. Some of the things I said today might resonate with you. Some might be like, yeah, that worked for a while, but we changed things, etc. So if you're either far ahead or feeling far behind on your data journey, there's still a lot to be learned and played with. And hopefully today, I'll get to learn from some of you. So with that, thank you so much for having me and looking forward to our discussion. And Hannah, let me know if you want me to stop screen sharing.
Yeah, sure. Why don't you take your slides down? Thank you so much, Joy. That was fantastic. I'm going to take us off recording as I promised.